Imagine being one of the most dangerous CIA operatives in the world. You have survived wars. You have walked into situations where one wrong decision could get you killed. You have trained yourself never to panic. And then, suddenly, you're strapped to a bed. You can't move. You don't know where you are. And every few minutes, someone tries to force information out of you. But there's one problem for your captors. They haven't broken you. Not yet. This is exactly where episode 4 of Lioness, titled Murder Hornets, begins. The previous episode left Joe McNamara in the hands of the Russians, and now the situation is getting much worse. Because Joe isn't simply being held hostage, the Russians are preparing to move her, and once she leaves American soil, finding her could become almost impossible. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning. Joe has been held captive for days. She's exhausted. She's injured. She's being subjected to waterboarding. Yet even under extreme physical pressure, Joe refuses to give her captors what they want. Instead, she starts talking. One of the Russian captors begins explaining his view of the war and why he believes America is losing its influence. But Joe doesn't listen quietly. She fights back with words. She attacks Russian leadership. She mocks the idea that Putin is some kind of unstoppable leader. And despite everything being done to her, Joe remains mentally sharp. This is one of the most important things about Joe's character. Her greatest weapon isn't always a gun. It's her mind. While her captor is talking, Joe is studying him. She's listening to his language. She's watching his movements, and she's looking for weaknesses. Then the man leaves. For the first time, Joe is alone. And immediately, she starts testing the restraints. She pulls against the straps. She tries to loosen the head restraints. She's looking for anything that might give her even a few seconds of freedom. Because Joe understands something her captors may have forgotten. A prisoner doesn't need to escape completely. Sometimes, all they need is one opportunity. But before Joe can get free, the Russians return. They cover her face, tie her down, and carry her out. And now we finally discover where Joe has been held, a private airport hangar. There is a plane waiting. Joe is being moved. And this changes the entire situation, because the CIA may still have a chance to rescue her, but that window is closing fast. Back in Washington, Kaitlyn Meade and Byron Westfield are facing a completely different kind of battle. There are no guns here, no explosions. Just maps, intelligence reports, and people trying to calculate the consequences of a disaster. Kaitlyn and Byron brief the senior officials on Joe's disappearance. Everyone understands the danger. If Russia keeps Joe inside the United States, there is still a possibility of a direct rescue. But if Russia gets her out of the country, everything changes. And there is another problem. Yurimov. The United States captured the Russian operative, and so far he hasn't provided the CIA with any major intelligence. Now Russia may try to trade him for Joe. But that creates a diplomatic nightmare, because accepting the trade could force the United States to publicly acknowledge what it did, and that could damage relations with America's allies. But the worst-case scenario is even darker. What if Russia doesn't want Yurimov back? What if they hand Joe over to Iran? At that point, Joe could become something much more dangerous than a prisoner. She could become a political weapon. She knows too much. She knows about CIA operations. She knows people. She knows targets. She knows how the Lioness program works. And if Iran gets access to her, the consequences could be enormous. Secretary Mullins asks the obvious question. How much time do they have? Byron explains that the CIA is already exploring multiple possibilities. They're watching airports, they're watching ports, they're tracking potential routes, they're trying to predict where the Russians will take her. Mullins then suggests something even bigger. Maybe they need to inform the president. But Byron argues against it. For now, keeping the circle small is safer. The fewer people who know, the fewer opportunities there are for the operation to leak. But that decision won't last forever, because Joe is already being loaded onto a plane, and no one knows where she's going. Meanwhile, Kaitlyn returns to Quantico. Joe's team has managed to identify the location where she was being held, a hangar outside Baltimore. The team moves quickly. They launch an assault. But when they arrive, Joe is gone. Not 5 hours late. Not 1 hour late. Only about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That's all it took. Inside the hangar, they find traces of blood. They swab the evidence. They search the rooms. But there is no Joe. And then Kyle makes a decision that changes the tone of the entire mission. He kills one of the Russian operatives. Another Russian is captured. Kyle forces him to reveal the aircraft's tail number. They finally have something. A possible lead. But there is a problem. The aircraft's transponder has been disabled. So even with the tail number, they don't know where the plane is. The Russians have disappeared into the sky. And Joe is on board. But what happens next changes everything, because Kyle's decision to kill the Russian creates a new crisis inside the team.
Back at base, Bobby is furious.
He reports Kyle for killing an unarmed man, and he's right to be concerned. The team operates in a world where violence is expected, but there are still rules, there are still lines, and Kyle has just crossed one. Kaitlyn warns him, if word gets out about what happened, Kyle could be left to deal with the consequences alone. But Kyle refuses to apologize. He believes the situation is already beyond normal rules. Because if Jo gets out of the country, the secret she carries could compromise countless operations. To Kyle, this isn't just an extraction anymore, it's war. And that's the central theme of this episode. What happens when people who are supposed to operate in the shadows suddenly realize the rules are no longer protecting them? Kaitlyn tells Kyle to stand down, at least publicly, but privately she understands his reasoning. She knows how much Jo knows, and she knows what happens if the Russians get her to Iran. So Kaitlyn makes a dangerous decision. She gives Amber extraordinary authority. If the plane is located inside American airspace, Amber can force it to land. If it is discovered in international airspace, she has permission to engage. Think about what that means. The CIA isn't just trying to find Jo. They're preparing to shoot down the plane carrying her if necessary. The rescue mission has entered a completely different phase. The team still needs a way to find the aircraft, and that's where Alexandra comes in. Kaitlyn sends Kyle to question her about Russian safe houses, travel routes, and escape networks. If the Russians are moving Jo secretly, they'll need infrastructure. They'll need people, they'll need places to hide, and the CIA needs to know where those places are. But while the field team searches for Jo, Byron is thinking about the bigger picture. He goes to Mullins privately, and this time the warning is even more serious. Byron believes Russia may hand Jo over to Iran. If that happens, the United States could face a diplomatic catastrophe. He even suggests returning Yeremov. Give the Russians what they want, get Jo back. But Byron also admits something important. The situation may now be too serious to keep hidden. Maybe it's finally time to brief the president. Then the story suddenly jumps backward, 6 months earlier. And this is where the episode becomes much more interesting, because now we see Jo's life before her capture. Her family is still recovering from the attack on their home. Neal is terrified. He doesn't want the girls going to school. He's taking time away from work, and Jo is trying to convince him to prepare for the possibility that the danger will happen again. She wants him to learn how to use a gun. Neal doesn't want to hear it. He's a doctor. His job is to save people, not hurt them. And this becomes a powerful argument between them. Jo believes the world is becoming increasingly dangerous. Neal believes that accepting violence as normal will only make their lives worse. Jo tells them they need to be prepared. Neal fires back with a question that exposes the contradiction. If this place is supposed to be safer, why does he need a gun? Jo doesn't have an easy answer, because Neal is right, but Jo is also right. That's what makes their relationship so compelling. They're not arguing about a weapon. They're arguing about the kind of world their family is living in. Eventually, Neal admits what he's really feeling. He's not angry. He's scared. And for a moment, Jo's professional world collides with her personal life. Then she leaves for work. But before she goes, Neal sees the news about the Russian operative who has been arrested. He asks Jo about it. She doesn't tell him the truth. She deflects, because that's what Jo does. She protects her family by keeping them in the dark, even when that darkness is becoming impossible to maintain. At the CIA, Jo is already working on something much bigger. With Amber and Alexandra's help, she begins a counterintelligence operation called Operation Treasure. The objective is to expose American officials who have secretly been compromised by Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. And here's the clever part. The CIA doesn't know exactly who all the traitors are, so they create panic. A Russian operative has been arrested. The people inside the network will hear about it. And when they become frightened, they'll contact their Russian handlers. Those communications will expose them. The CIA doesn't need to chase every spy. They just need to make the spies panic and wait for them to reveal themselves. To trigger the operation, Kaitlyn and Byron arrange a diplomatic meeting with Maxim at a restaurant. They bring Amber, Alexandra, and several undercover agents. Maxim sits across from them. He defends Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He denies involvement in the attack on Jo's home, but then he begins asking questions. He wants to know about Yeremov. He wants to know what happened to the Russian operative. Kaitlyn and Byron give him almost nothing. And that's deliberate. The less they say, the more nervous Maxim becomes. He's trying to gather intelligence. Instead, he's revealing how much he cares about the situation. And then comes another discovery. After Maxim leaves, Kaitlyn finds a listening device underneath the table. The Russians were listening. They were watching. This wasn't just an American operation. It was a game of counterintelligence, and both sides were trying to figure out what the other side knew. But this is only the beginning, because Jo's team has another trap waiting, and this one is much more personal. At a local club, Jo, Bobby, Tucker, Cruz, and Josie launch another part of Operation Treasure. This time, they're using a honey trap. The objective is to identify another compromised American. The operation looks almost casual from the outside. Music, drinks, flirting, but underneath all of it is a carefully planned intelligence operation. Every movement has a purpose. Every conversation is being monitored, and eventually the target takes the bait. Another mole is exposed. Another connection is revealed. Joe's team is slowly pulling on a thread, and they believe that if they keep pulling, they'll eventually reach the person at the center of the network, the Queen. But there's something unsettling about this entire operation. Joe and her team are hunting Russian spies, yet the Russians appear to be watching them just as closely. And this raises one of the biggest questions of the episode. What if Operation Treasure wasn't as successful as Joe believed? What if the Russians knew they were being hunted? What if some of the people the CIA thought they were discovering were actually bait? It's possible that the Russians weren't simply losing operatives. They may have been feeding the CIA information, leading them towards carefully selected targets, learning how the Americans operate, learning who responds, learning who gives the orders, and perhaps learning exactly how to get to Joe. That possibility makes the entire timeline feel different, because 6 months earlier, Joe believed she was hunting the enemy, but in the present, she's the one sitting in a Russian prison. Could those two things be connected? The episode doesn't give us a definitive answer, but it leaves the door wide open. Now we return to the present, and the situation has become even more desperate. Joe has been missing for 5 days. The CIA still doesn't know where the plane went. The transponder is off, there is no flight plan, and the Russians are disappearing from the radar. Kaitlyn knows the clock is running out, so she goes to see Neal. This scene is completely different from the tactical sequences. There are no weapons, no helicopters, no intelligence briefings, just a husband waiting for news about his wife. Kaitlyn has to explain what might happen next, and there are 3 possibilities. The first is simple. They find Joe before she leaves the country, they rescue her, she comes home. But that possibility is becoming less likely with every passing hour. The second possibility is a long negotiation. Russia could use Joe as a bargaining chip. The CIA might spend months or even years trying to secure her release. And then comes the third possibility, the one neither of them wants to say. Joe may never come home. Neal tries to process what he's hearing. Kaitlyn doesn't give him false hope. She tells him to prepare for the worst. And this is where the emotional power really lands, because the entire season has been about national security, geopolitics, CIA operations, Russian intelligence, Iran, but suddenly none of that matters. Not to Neal. He doesn't care about the geopolitical consequences. He wants his wife back, and his daughters want their mother. That's the human cost hiding underneath every covert operation. Meanwhile, the CIA continues searching. They have the aircraft's tail number, they have evidence from the hangar, they have blood samples, they have intelligence about Russian routes, but they still don't have the one thing they need, Joe. And the longer the search continues, the more dangerous the situation becomes. If the Russians reach international waters or international airspace, America's options become increasingly limited. If they reach a country willing to protect them, the CIA may have to negotiate. And if Joe reaches Iran, the entire mission could become a political spectacle. That is what makes the episode so tense. The team isn't racing toward a known destination. They're racing against time itself. And there's another layer to the story, Joe's own philosophy. Earlier, she told Neal that the world has always been violent. Political assassinations have existed for centuries. Kings have been killed, presidents have been assassinated, revolutions have been fought. Violence, in Joe's view, isn't something the modern world invented. It's always been there. But now Joe is experiencing the other side of that philosophy. She's not the person carrying out the operation. She's the person trapped inside it. She's become the target. And for the first time, the people who love her are forced to live with the consequences of the world she chose. The episode ends with Joe still missing, and the CIA running out of time. Kaitlyn visits Neal and gives him the 3 possible outcomes. First, the team could rescue Joe before the Russians get her out of the country. Second, Russia could use Joe as a bargaining chip, leading to negotiations that might last months or even years. And the final possibility is the one nobody wants to hear. Joe may never come home. Meanwhile, the CIA still doesn't know where the Russian plane went. Its transponder is disabled, leaving the team with almost no way to track it. But the flashbacks give us another important clue. 6 months earlier, Joe was already hunting Russian moles through Operation Treasure. That raises a disturbing question. Did the Russians discover Joe's operation and use it to set a trap for her? If so, Joe's kidnapping may not have been a random act of revenge. It could have been part of a much larger counterintelligence plan. That's what makes Murder Hornets so tense. Joe is usually the hunter, but now she's the target. The CIA has to find her before she disappears into Russian or Iranian hands. And if they fail, the consequences could reach far beyond Joe herself. The episode ends without giving us a rescue, only a terrifying question. Can the Lioness team find Joe before it's too late?